January 1260 marked the midpoint of winter in northern Syria. Picture yourself atop the ramparts of Aleppo, one of the Islamic world's grandest metropolises. The air bites, the night is black, and then, peering beyond the fortifications, you witness them. Not mere dozens of campfires, nor hundreds, but thousands stretching endlessly across the horizon in every direction, east, west, north, south. A literal ocean of fire appears to consume the entire landscape, and at the heart of this blaze, shrouded in darkness, resides Hulagu Khan. The city around you is far from silent. For weeks, refugees have streamed in, from Haran, from Edessa, from Manbij, from countless towns you've known your whole life, towns that now simply cease to exist. They arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and tales too horrific to recount. Now, each and every one of them is enclosed within these walls alongside you. Yet, here's the crucial detail. You're not in a state of panic, not truly.
This is Aleppo, and Aleppo has never succumbed to an adversary attempting to conquer it by force. The Crusaders made repeated attempts and invariably failed. Even Saladin, the illustrious Saladin himself, spent almost a decade warring and negotiating before he could even lay claim to this city. No army in a century and a half had managed to seize Aleppo through direct assault. Towering above you, rising 60 feet into the sky from an artificial hill encircled by a broad moat, stands the citadel, Syria's most formidable fortress. Constructed by Saladin's own son, its singular entry path winds through multiple chambers designed to ensnare and massacre attackers. Its walls are massive enough to withstand any assault. You gaze up at it, convinced that whatever onslaught comes, that citadel will endure. You are correct about the citadel's strength. However, you are profoundly mistaken about everything else. In just 6 days, this city, a metropolis that had stood for millennia, would be reduced to ash and bloodshed. And the 6 days following the siege would prove even more devastating than the siege itself. My name is your name. Today, we journey back to January 1260, the moment one of the medieval world's most significant cities was obliterated. This is the narrative of Aleppo, of the unlikely, almost impossible alliance that brought about its downfall, the subsequent devastation, and how that destruction initiated a chain of events that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the medieval era. This is what transpired before Ain Jalut. If you're new here, this channel offers history the meticulous examination it merits. Subscribe now so you don't miss what's next, because, truly, this story only becomes more incredible from this point. Before delving into its destruction, it's essential to grasp the true nature of what was lost. Aleppo wasn't merely a city, it was a testament. Strategically positioned at Syria's northern frontier, Aleppo held one of the most vital locations in the entire medieval world. It served as the gateway, the final major stop on trade routes emanating from Mesopotamia before they diverged, westward towards Mediterranean ports or southward into the Levant. Merchants laden with silk, spices, and precious metals from distant lands like China and India traversed through Aleppo. Its marketplaces, caravanserais, and workshops constituted the vibrant economic heart of northern Syria. To control Aleppo was to govern the flow of commerce across an entire region. Allow me to add another layer of context, as it's easy to view this city solely in military terms: walls, citadel, gates, and thereby overlook what truly rendered it irreplaceable. In 1260, Aleppo was ancient. Not merely old like your grandfather's house, but ancient in the way that entire civilizations are considered ancient. Human habitation had persisted on this site for an astonishing 8,000 to 10,000 years. That is not an error. 10 millennia of continuous occupancy. By the time the Mongols arrived in January 1260, Aleppo had already outlasted the Bronze Age collapse, Assyrian conquests, Greek conquests, Roman domination, Byzantine rule, Arab conquests, Crusader sieges, and half a dozen other cataclysms that would have erased lesser cities from memory. It had been razed previously. It had been plundered before. Yet each time, it rebounded. This resilience was not solely physical, it was cultural.
Over these millennia, Aleppo had amassed a nuanced identity unlike any other city in the region. It was Muslim, Christian, and Jewish simultaneously, in ways that indicated genuine integration rather than mere coexistence. Its souks, or covered markets, were among the most advanced commercial infrastructures in the medieval world, featuring specialized markets for every conceivable type of good: spices, fabrics, metals, animals, leather, soap. Aleppo's renowned laurel oil soap was exported across the Mediterranean. The city's textile workshops produced fabrics traded as far west as Europe. This was no backwater. It was a key economic engine of the medieval world. Politically, by 1260, Aleppo was governed by the Ayyubid dynasty, direct political descendants of Saladin. The reigning sultan, al-Nasir Yusuf, held sway over both Aleppo and Damascus, making him the region's most formidable remaining Ayyubid leader. The Ayyubids had managed Aleppo since its integration into Saladin's empire in 1183. His progeny, al-Zahir Ghazi, governed the city for 3 decades, during which he heavily invested in expanding and reinforcing the citadel, erecting madrasas and mosques, and consequently elevating Aleppo to a prominent cultural hub within the Islamic world. By 1260, this legacy was al-Nasir Yusuf's to either safeguard or forfeit. Then there was the citadel. It's crucial to grasp the extraordinary nature of this edifice, as it underpins all subsequent events. The Aleppo citadel stands atop a natural tell, an ancient, roughly oval mound, rising about 15 meters above the surrounding urban area. Over several decades, Saladin's son, al-Zahir Ghazi, meticulously transformed this ancient acropolis into what many consider Syria's finest medieval fortress. The moat encircling it, over 70 feet wide, was deeply carved into the bedrock, no mere ditch, but a veritable abyss. A solitary stone bridge provided access to the entrance. This entrance was meticulously designed as a deadly gauntlet from the very first step. Traversing the bridge led visitors into a gateway tower that twisted sharply multiple times, forcing potential attackers to engage around corners, thus disrupting their momentum, formation, and ultimately costing them lives at every turn. The walls themselves were colossal, not only thick but expertly angled to deflect projectiles. Internally, it possessed the provisions to sustain a garrison for many months. Simply put, conventional armies did not storm the citadel of Aleppo. It was an impregnable fortress. In the early 11th century, crusaders repeatedly failed in their attempts to seize Aleppo, never even coming close. Richard the Lionheart, widely regarded as one of medieval Europe's most accomplished military strategists, never even contemplated an assault, as the strategic disadvantages were too overwhelming. These weren't small, disorganized units. They were elite knights and professional soldiers from Western Europe, operating at the zenith of Crusader military might. Hence, when Hulagu's forces appeared in January 1260, the inhabitants of Aleppo had historical precedent on their side. Every prior instance suggested that a determined defense within that citadel could outlast any besieging army. This wholly rational, historically rooted conviction was precisely what made the impending catastrophe so utterly devastating. For the Mongols were unlike any adversaries witnessed before. They did not adhere to established precedents, they forged new ones. Now, I wish to offer my candid assessment of al-Nasir Yusuf, the Sultan of Aleppo, as I believe he warrants direct criticism that history has often omitted. This individual was well aware of the impending Mongol advance. For years, he had received ultimatums from Hulagu, formal demands for capitulation delivered by diplomatic envoys. He had witnessed Baghdad's fall in 1258. He had observed countless cities either surrender or be razed. He had ample warning and sufficient time to orchestrate a robust defense or negotiate a surrender that might have preserved his people. His response was to offer gifts, procrastinate, and ultimately, when the Mongol army materialized at his doorstep, he abandoned his own city and fled southward toward Karak. He left his citizenry within those walls without effective leadership at the highest echelon. Whatever bravery the defenders displayed in the subsequent days was in spite of their sultan, not because of him. Let me be clear. I am not implying that every ruler must perish alongside their city. History is complex, and sometimes a strategic withdrawal is the appropriate course of action. However, there is a substantial distinction between a calculated strategic withdrawal and merely fleeing to preserve one's own life while leaving everyone else to face the repercussions. And Al-Nazir Yusuf was the individual entrusted to lead the defense of the Islamic world's gateway to the Levant. He possessed the resources, the fortifications, and the forewarning. He chose none of these alternatives and departed. That decision reverberates through everything that unfolded thereafter, and I believe it merits direct acknowledgement. You are already familiar with Hulagu Khan's actions in Baghdad. We need not dwell on the full horrors of 1258 here. That narrative warrants its own dedicated video. What is pertinent for our current discussion is what transpired next. The sheer momentum that propelled Hulagu's army westward after Baghdad is among the most extraordinary aspects of this entire campaign. Subsequent to Baghdad's fall in February 1258, Hulagu did not halt. He neither consolidated his gains, rested, nor waited. He advanced. He secured the allegiance of various local rulers across Iraq, and then redirected his focus north and west toward Syria. This was in accordance with a mandate from his brother, the great Khan Monk, the supreme sovereign of the Mongol Empire, instructing him to continue his advance until either the world submitted or the ocean impeded his progress. The directive was unambiguous. The directive was to subdue the Ismailis, dismantle the Abbasid Caliphate, bring the Ayyubid states of Syria under control, and then confront the Mamluks in Egypt. A comprehensive plan for the complete conquest of the Islamic Near East, issued by the era's most powerful individual. The assassins were already neutralized, their mountain stronghold of Alamut having fallen in 1256. The Abbasid Caliphate, too, was gone, with Baghdad capitulating in 1258. Now it was Syria's turn. By late 1259, Hulagu had deployed his forces into the Jazira region, the northern Mesopotamian territory situated between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, north of Iraq. Events there unfolded with startling rapidity and precision. The city of Nisibis was seized. Amid taken, Edessa, for which crusaders had previously fought and died over a century prior, yielded without significant opposition. Harran followed suit. These weren't minor settlements. They were substantial urban centers with histories spanning centuries. They crumbled in succession, like falling dominoes, usually within days. Some resisted and were consequently devastated. Most did not. By 1259, the Mongol methodology was widely understood throughout the area. Submit and you live. Resist and nothing endures. Not structures, not infrastructure, not the adult male populace. Nothing. The brilliance, if one dares call it that, of the Mongol psychological campaign meant that terror often accomplished most of the work before their army even arrived. Cities surrendered not out of cowardice, but from a pragmatic calculation of their chances. Manbij, a city nestled between the Euphrates and Aleppo, and one of the final stops before the major Syrian city, was nevertheless plundered. This sent an unambiguous message to Aleppo about its impending fate. Then, a remarkable phenomenon began in Aleppo itself. Refugees started pouring in. According to Bar Hebraeus, the Syriac Christian chronicler who was present in Aleppo during these incidents, and whose first-hand account is a crucial source, the entire populace of northern Syria's regions began to inundate Aleppo throughout 1259. It wasn't a trickle, but a deluge. The chronicler Ibn Shaddad, the Aleppo historian, corroborates this depiction and offers further details regarding the aftermath. The cities of Harran, Edessa, Saruj, and Raqqa were either deserted or razed. The fortress town of Kalat Jabbar surrendered but was destroyed nonetheless. The countryside was being emptied. Tens of thousands, suddenly displaced, streamed into a city on the brink of encirclement.
What I believe is often overlooked in popular retellings of this era is that while the Mongols are frequently portrayed as an unstoppable singular force of destruction, the reality is far more intricate and, frankly, compelling. The Mongols were adept at exploiting existing divisions within any society they encountered. Their conquest of Syria didn't rely solely on brute force. They persuaded Syria's neighbors, including some of its historical adversaries, to aid their cause. They identified those with long-standing grievances, those with ambitions, and those with logical reasons to favor Mongol dominion over Ayyubid control, then forged coalitions based on these assessments. This demonstrates a level of political sophistication that far transcends simple military conquest. Genghis Khan's successors weren't merely the most formidable military power of their age, they were also among its most astute political strategists. Hulagu crossed the Euphrates in late 1259, moving with the characteristic speed of the Mongol army. He swiftly encircled Aleppo, catching the defenders unprepared and preventing any coordinated regional response. A final ultimatum was issued. The people of Aleppo, relying on their citadel and its walls, which had withstood sieges for a century and a half, refused. The siege commenced on January 18, 1260. Hulagu's subsequent actions illustrate a key aspect of Mongol operations at their zenith. This wasn't a disorganized assault on the walls. It was methodical, highly organized, and terrifyingly efficient, with a level of coordination worth detailing because it explains why the defenders had no realistic chance. Aleppo possessed multiple gates, each a potential point for attack, escape, or resupply. In a conventional siege, an attacker might concentrate their forces on one or 2 points. Hulagu, however, assigned a specific commander to each gate, effectively creating 4 distinct fronts that would exert simultaneous pressure, thus preventing the defenders from consolidating their strength at any single location. Urakutu led the assault at the Jews' Gate. Kitbuka, one of Hulagu's most trusted and skilled generals, a Christian Turk whose name is crucial for future events, commanded at the Anatolia Gate. At the Damascus Gate stood Sunak, and personally overseeing operations from the Antioch Gate was Hulagu Khan himself. This information comes directly from Rashid al-Din's Jami al-Tawarikh, the officially sanctioned history of the Mongol Empire. This chronicle was penned by a Persian administrator who had direct access to the Mongol court's records. When searching for primary accounts from the Mongol side of this campaign, this source is unparalleled. It reveals that this entire operation was meticulously planned, leaving nothing to chance or improvisation. Consider the significant implications of Hulagu personally taking a position at the Antioch Gate. He wasn't remote, directing from a safe command post miles behind the front lines. He was right at the city walls. This had both tactical importance, keeping his commanders focused and maintaining maximum pressure, and psychological impact on both his own forces and the city's defenders. When the leader renowned for demolishing Baghdad is physically present at your gate, the psychological effect is profound. A complete wooden stockade, known as a chappa, was erected around the city, effectively halting all entry and exit. The city was hermetically sealed. Subsequently, catapults and mangonels were strategically positioned and loaded. While you might be envisioning conventional medieval siege engines, it's crucial to significantly scale up that image and appreciate the advanced technological prowess involved. Over several decades, the Mongols had evolved into masters of siege warfare through an extraordinary process. Initially, the Mongols were exclusively cavalry warriors, exceptionally effective in open-field engagements, but considerably constrained when confronting fortified strongholds. Genghis Khan himself recognized this military deficiency and systematically addressed it. As they conquered various civilizations, they incorporated the technical knowledge of each. From the Chinese, they assimilated the most advanced siege engineering of the era, including sophisticated trebuchets, gunpowder weapons, and the skilled engineers required to construct and operate them. From the Persians, they acquired expertise in fortification and counter-fortification techniques.
Their conquests of various Islamic states further augmented their specialized knowledge. By 1260, the Mongol military was far more than a cavalry force that had picked up a few siege tactics. It represented the world's most comprehensively integrated combined arms military organization. They were adept at urban warfare, siege warfare, naval warfare, and open-field cavalry operations, excelling in all four domains simultaneously in a way no contemporary power could rival. All this formidable capability was brought to bear upon Aleppo's walls. The siege machinery began its relentless assault. The sounds emanating from within the city must have been insistent and soul-crushing. The continuous thump of stones battering walls, the groaning and splintering of stressed timbers, and the thunderous impact of projectiles, day after day, hour after hour. The defenders possessed their own catapults and retaliated where possible, but they were severely disadvantaged in terms of troop numbers, projectile reserves, and the ability to rotate their crews. It is vital to acknowledge that the defenders fought gallantly. The inhabitants of Aleppo, soldiers, militiamen, and even armed civilians, did not capitulate easily. They held the walls, returned fire, and exploited every advantage their fortified position offered. Rashid al-Din explicitly confirms that both sides engaged in intense combat for an entire week. Syrian historical records corroborate this account. These were not individuals inclined to surrender without a fight, especially given their awareness, vividly recounted by refugees within their walls, of the fate awaiting cities that fell to the Mongols. They fought with the desperate resolve born of this knowledge. However, the inescapable reality of siege warfare presented a fundamental challenge for the defenders. With each passing hour of the siege, the defenders lost personnel, depleted supplies, expended energy, and saw their morale erode. In stark contrast, the attackers had the entire surrounding countryside at their disposal. They rotated shifts for rest, received regular provisions, fresh ammunition arrived constantly, and new troops could be cycled in. The defenders had no such relief. They couldn't rotate personnel or resupply. Every man lost on the walls represented an irreplaceable casualty. Every projectile that damaged a section of the wall represented destruction that could not be repaired under fire. The attrition dynamics of a sustained siege are brutal and unrelenting, and they invariably favor the besiegers. The Mongols were not pressed for time. They had countless prior experiences with such operations and were confident of the outcome. The precise details of Aleppo's urban defense remain largely unknown to us. We cannot say whether there were internal debates about surrender, or if arguments were made for yielding before it was too late. We do not know the names of the garrison commanders who remained after their sultan had fled. The historical sources provide the general outline of events, but lack the intimate texture of individual decisions. What is indisputable is the conclusion. After approximately a week of continuous bombardment and attacks from multiple directions, the city's defenses collapsed. This breach did not occur at any of the heavily fortified main gates, nor at the citadel itself. The breakthrough occurred at the Iraq Gate. Why specifically the Iraq Gate? The historical records do not provide an exhaustive tactical analysis. The most plausible explanation points to a combination of factors. Situated facing northeast, the Iraq Gate was in the direct path of the Mongol advance, and the surrounding terrain facilitated the deployment of their most intensive siege equipment. It's conceivable that this particular section of the wall was the oldest, endured the most prolonged bombardment, or had its defenders most severely depleted by days of relentless attack. Perhaps the siege engine operators in that sector possessed exceptional skill. Alternatively, the wall may have harbored a structural vulnerability that Mongol engineers expertly identified and targeted. Irrespective of the precise mix of conditions, that is where the breach ultimately materialized. When a medieval city's defensive wall collapses, the psychological repercussions are nearly as profound as the physical damage. The deafening crash of collapsing masonry, coupled with the battle cries of the invading forces pouring through the opening, reverberates throughout the entire city. Every soldier manning a different section of the wall hears it. Every civilian seeking refuge indoors hears it. In that precise instant, the strategic outlook shifts entirely. The question is no longer if the city will fall, but merely when. Once the outer defenses were breached, urban warfare commenced, block by block, district by district. This is where the Armenian and Frankish units brought by Hulagu proved their indispensable worth. Hedim's Armenian cavalry and Bohemon's Frankish troops were not steppe warriors like the Mongols. They were seasoned soldiers who had spent their lives in such environments, proficient in fighting through narrow passageways and around blind corners, expert at clearing buildings, and adept at navigating the intricate urban geography of a medieval Syrian city. Mongol cavalry, while devastatingly effective on open ground, loses its advantage in an urban setting. Possessing soldiers whose capabilities complemented the Mongol forces, essentially urban combat specialists, proved crucial, transforming what might have been a protracted, grueling urban conflict into a swift conquest. The city capitulated. By January 24th, just 6 days after the siege began, the outer city was under Mongol control. The streets, once bustling with merchants, scholars, artisans, and travelers from across the globe, were now filled with soldiers and smoke. Yet the citadel remained defiant. Even as the city below succumbed, the garrison within the citadel held its ground. From atop their 60-foot hill, they witnessed scenes of utter pandemonium. Fires raging across multiple districts, the din of battle, and then the more chilling sounds that follow combat, with smoke rising so densely it obscured the winter sky. And still, they refused to open the gates. The citadel of Aleppo, fulfilling the precise function its designers had envisioned through decades of meticulous construction, became the final bastion of organized resistance in a city that had otherwise ceased to exist as a viable entity. What I find truly remarkable, and something that I believe warrants clear articulation, is that those defending the citadel were under no illusions. They were fully aware the city had fallen. They harbored no realistic hope of relief. Al-Nasir Yusuf had already fled. No Ayyubid army was en route to save them. No one was coming. They observed the destruction of everything they had been protecting, and yet they persevered. Whether that demonstrated extraordinary courage or extraordinary desperation, I am genuinely uncertain if there's a meaningful distinction between the two in such dire circumstances. When all favorable options are exhausted and one still refuses to yield, it speaks to a profound manifestation of the human spirit. I don't wish to romanticize their actions. These were soldiers in an impossible situation, not fictional characters. But I do feel compelled to acknowledge their resolve. They held firm beneath the citadel's walls. The 6 days following the city's fall were about to commence, and that particular chapter is considerably grimmer than anything we have explored thus far. Before we delve into the subsequent events, and I must caution you that this narrative becomes significantly darker. If you've been following this channel for some time and haven't yet subscribed, now would be an exceptionally good moment to do so. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments as well. Given everything you understand about Mongol tactics and the strategic calculation between resistance and surrender, I'm eager to know if you believe the people of Aleppo made the right choice. There is no simple answer here, but I would genuinely appreciate hearing your perspective as this question continues to resonate with me. A phrase frequently appears in the historical accounts describing Aleppo's fate in the days after its collapse. The massacre, they report, was methodical and thorough. I want to dwell on those two words for a moment, as they convey immense meaning within a concise expression. Methodical, thorough. These terms do not suggest a chaotic mob running rampant. Rather, they depict a structured system, a deliberate process, something organized and intentional. These individuals understood their actions and executed them with deliberate intent. The slaughter stretched over 6 days, during which Hulagu's forces systematically swept through the city. They employed a triage system on the vanquished populace, a method refined through years of Mongol experience in managing seized territories. This wasn't their first application of such a strategy. Baghdad had undergone a similar process 2 years prior. A well-established procedure was in place and strictly adhered to. Adult Muslim men were executed. Historical records are almost entirely consistent on this point. The operational rationale from the Mongol perspective was starkly logical. Able-bodied men represented a potential source of future resistance. They had chosen to fight, costing the Mongol army time and lives during the siege. Eliminating them meant eradicating any prospect of a subsequent rebellion, which would demand another campaign and further expenditure of Mongol lives and resources. It was the brutal calculus of occupation, executed with the thoroughness characteristic of the Mongol system. Women and children were not killed, but enslaved, fed into the vast Mongol slave networks that spanned Central Asia. This cannot be construed as an act of compassion. 13th century slavery was atrocious, dehumanizing, and frequently lethal in itself. However, it offered a different potential outcome, providing a chance for survival, adaptation, and eventually, the possibility of establishing some form of existence within the Mongol world, however diminished. The Mongol Empire possessed an immense need for human labor and talent in various forms, viewing women and children as resources rather than threats. Artisans, craftspeople, engineers, and skilled workers of all types were captured and kept alive. This particular detail is critical, and I wish to dwell on it momentarily, as I believe it illuminates an essential aspect of how Mongol conquests actually unfolded. The Mongols were not merely destroyers. In a profound and tangible sense, they were collectors of human capabilities. When they razed a city, they weren't extinguishing its knowledge, skills, or technical expertise. Instead, they were disseminating these assets across the Mongol domain. The master weavers of Aleppo, the metallurgists, the architects, physicians, and scholars, these individuals were transported eastward, their skills leveraged for Mongol objectives, and their expertise absorbed into the empire. Rashid al-Din specifically chronicles the imprisonment of many artisans and the seizure of untold spoils. The lives of these craftspeople, though undoubtedly horrific by any humane standard, were at least not immediately ended. It is crucial to acknowledge and reflect on the implications of this. The Mongol conquests triggered an immense redistribution of human talent throughout Eurasia. Some of the most sophisticated cultural and technological knowledge from the 13th century Islamic world ultimately found preservation and transmission through Mongol patronage. This was not due to any particular affinity the Mongols held for Islamic culture, but rather their general appreciation for expertise and their willingness to exploit it. This fact does not mitigate the catastrophic nature of the conquests for those who endured them. However, it complicates any simplistic narrative that positions the Mongols solely as agents of destruction, opposing civilization. Then there is the matter of Aleppo's Christian community. Here, the narrative becomes genuinely intricate, and I believe many popular accounts either gloss over this complexity or completely sidestep it. While Muslim men were systematically slaughtered and Muslim women enslaved, Aleppo's Christian population was largely, though not entirely, spared. The Encyclopedia Iranica explicitly states that Eastern Christians were protected during the massacres in both Baghdad and Aleppo. This was not a random occurrence. It reflected the specific composition of the coalition that had just demolished the city and the personal inclinations of its commander. Hulagu himself possessed a genuine favorable disposition towards Christianity. His mother, Sorgatani Beki, was a prominent Christian, not merely a passive believer, but an actively devout one. His favorite wife, Dokuz Khatun, was also Christian and, by all accounts, highly influential within his court. His most trusted general, Kidbuka, was Christian. He informed the Armenian historian Vardan Araveltsi in 1264 that he had been Christian since birth. During its early decades, the Ilkhanate was an empire where Christians held privileged positions to an extent unprecedented in the region's history since before the Islamic conquests. I want to proceed cautiously here, as I do not wish to reduce this to a simple dichotomy of Mongols being benevolent towards Christians and hostile towards Muslims. The historical reality was more multifaceted and contingent. There are reports of Christians dying in the aftermath of Aleppo, and the protection extended to Christians was never absolute or unconditional. The preferential treatment for Christians, determined by the Mongols' political agenda, could be revoked as soon as the political landscape shifted. Nevertheless, the established pattern remains sufficiently evident and constant to warrant direct acknowledgement. The sectarian composition of the victorious alliance determined which groups survived. The very pact that led Armenian and Crusader soldiers to the gates of Aleppo also meant that the city's Christian community benefited from a protection that their Muslim neighbors did not. I find this deeply unsettling. It should be disquieting because it reveals that the obliteration of one of the Islamic world's magnificent cities wasn't merely an external assault. It was in part facilitated by individuals who had coexisted with those Muslims for generations. This truth is more challenging to confront than the straightforward narrative of an outside invasion. And in my view, it merits forthright disclosure. Now, let's turn our attention to the Great Mosque. The Grand Mosque of Aleppo, also known as the Zachary Mosque, ranked among the most venerable and historically significant Islamic sites throughout Syria. Its origins traced back to a Byzantine cathedral established by Saint Helena, mother of Constantine the Great, itself erected on the former site of a pagan temple. It had been converted into a mosque during the initial Islamic conquest of Syria and had undergone successive rebuildings and expansions over centuries, reaching its most prominent form under the distinguished Zangid ruler Nur al-Din in the 12th century. Its minaret, an 11th century structure of extraordinary artistry, represented one of the architectural marvels of the medieval Islamic world. This was more than just a building. It was a living testament to 12 centuries of history, a place where the Islamic civilization of northern Syria had literally inscribed its narrative in stone. It was incinerated. The identity of those responsible for its burning remains a subject of genuine historical debate, and the very existence of this debate is revealing. One account, endorsed by Riley Smith and other scholars, contends that Bohemond VI of Antioch, the Frankish crusader, personally directed the mosque's destruction. He was, after all, a crusader prince engaged in the conquest of a Muslim city. Burning the mosque might have appeared not only permissible, but fitting to him, an act of religious warfare within a campaign framed, at least partially, in religious terms. Another narrative attributes the burning primarily to Armenian troops commanded by Hethum. These two explanations are not necessarily mutually exclusive. It is entirely plausible that multiple parties participated with varying motives and degrees of premeditation. What transpired next is unequivocal. Hulagu was enraged. He ordered the execution of some of Hethum's soldiers specifically for torching the mosque. Why? This query strikes at the core of Hulagu's actual intentions in Syria, and I believe the answer profoundly elucidates the entire campaign. Hulagu was not merely a destructive force. He was a conqueror intent on governing, and a ruler who aims to administer a predominantly Muslim territory for decades across generations, cannot afford to be perceived as the individual who permitted the senseless burning of their most sacred sites. The calculation was coldly political. From a Mongol governance perspective, the massacre of men of fighting age was a necessary measure to secure the territory. From the same perspective, the burning of the Great Mosque was a gratuitous provocation that would complicate the governance of the remaining population, make future cities less inclined to surrender peacefully, and define the Mongol presence in Syria in terms that would foster permanent, irreconcilable animosity. Hulagu desired for Syria to operate under Mongol administration. A smoldering mosque presented an obstacle to that objective, so he made an example of the responsible soldiers, his own allies, to convey a message that transcended the immediate situation. This territory is now being administered. It will be governed in an orderly fashion. The era of unrestrained destruction is over. The combination of mass slaughter and meticulous management of symbols, that is, the Mongol system in action. And it is precisely what renders the Mongol conquests so resistant to straightforward moral categorization. This was not chaos. It was a deliberate strategy. By the conclusion of the sixth day following the city's fall, Aleppo had been transformed. The city that had endured for 10,000 years, a nexus of trade, a repository of centuries of accumulated wealth and culture, its free Muslim populace was gone. Its men were dead. Its women and children were being marched eastward into enslavement. Its artisans were being catalogued and rounded up. Its mosque was a scorched husk, and atop the hill, above it all, the citadel still stood. While the city below was consumed by fire and bloodshed, the citadel of Aleppo remained stoic on its perch. 32 days. That is how long the garrison held out after the city fell, from January 24th, when the outer city was overrun, until February 25th, 1260, when the citadel finally capitulated. For 32 days, they gazed upon a city that was merely a shell of its former self, devoid of hope for relief and stripped of all illusions. One can only imagine the ordeal endured within those fortifications. Soldiers witnessed the disintegration of everything they swore to protect right before their eyes. The smoke, a constant reminder, billowed from what once housed bustling markets, residential areas, and the Grand Mosque. In the initial days post-catastrophe, chilling cries from below echoed, indelible sounds that would haunt them for life. A stark realization settled in. No reinforcements were coming. If an army had been dispatched, it would have arrived by now. Their presumed leader, al-Nasir Yusuf, the Sultan of Aleppo, and the man tasked with overseeing the city's defense, was safely far south of Damascus, very much alive and absent from the unfolding tragedy. Trapped within the fortress, they faced a dwindling supply of food and water, surrounded by an unending sea of Mongol soldiers. The decision to persist was not rooted in any logical expectation of success. Instead, it stemmed from either immense bravery, profound despair, or the pragmatic understanding that surrendering immediately after the city's decimation offered no genuinely better outcome. Having witnessed the Mongols' atrocities against resistant cities, the choice to capitulate felt little different from continuing the fight. Yet the citadel held its ground for 32 days against the most formidable military power of the medieval era. Finally, on February 25, 1260, the citadel of Aleppo opened its gates. The aftermath was surprisingly lenient, especially considering the unparalleled destruction that had preceded it. The defenders of the citadel were, according to historical accounts, largely spared. However, the fortress itself was razed to the ground. Hulagu orchestrated the demolition of the stronghold while allowing the garrison to live. This calculated move aligns with the broader Mongol strategy to convey a specific message about compliance. Executing a garrison that had honorably surrendered would send a detrimental signal to all future fortified cities, essentially telling them that resistance to the death was their only rational choice, as surrender would lead to the same fate anyway. Such a message would transform every subsequent siege into a brutal war of annihilation. By sparing the garrison but leveling the fortress, the Mongols delivered their intended message. The stronghold is gone, the military threat eradicated, but the populace survives. Future garrisons were to draw their conclusions accordingly. A contrasting incident documented in the sources illuminates this strategy even further. When Hulagu seized the Harem fortress, a nearby stronghold that surrendered under a solemn guarantee of amnesty, he nevertheless had its defenders, along with their wives and children, put to death. The sole person spared was an Armenian goldsmith, whose skill rendered him valuable. This singular exception, one artisan, underscores the general rule. The lives of those particular defenders held no strategic significance, hence their demise. The citadel's garrison, however, represented too prominent and crucial a case study for Mongol governance to be treated similarly. Their survival was a calculated political statement, not an act of humanitarianism. After the citadel's fall and destruction, Hulagu appointed administrators and proceeded onward. Aleppo was now under Mongol administration. The route to Damascus lay unobstructed,
and news of Aleppo's fate spread more rapidly than any army could advance. Damascus heard. The Ayyubid princes of Hama and Homs also received the tidings, and their reaction was uniform. They came bearing tribute and the keys to their cities. Damascus, which had never succumbed to the Crusaders and had been the heart of Saladin's empire, opened its gates on March 1, 1260, without a single skirmish. Kitbuka rode in unopposed. The lesson of Aleppo had resonated. At this juncture, the Mongols had achieved something that genuinely astonished the medieval world. Not merely because it was unforeseen, but due to its sheer magnitude and swiftness. In roughly 2 years, they had annihilated the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, captured the most heavily fortified city in Syria in a mere 6 days, and secured the surrender of Damascus without a battle. The entire arc of the Islamic Near East, stretching from the Tigris to the Syrian coast, had been dismantled, with only Egypt remaining before them. There's a crucial aspect of Hulagu Khan that is often overlooked if one views him solely as a force of destruction, a common perception given the immense scale of his actions. However, I believe it's vital to complicate this portrayal, as this complexity holds significant historical importance. Hulagu was not merely a destroyer, he was also a builder. Indeed, the very man who orchestrated the massacre in Baghdad, the devastation of Aleppo, and the systematic elimination of hundreds of thousands of lives was simultaneously and with absolute seriousness striving to establish a functional imperial administration within the territories he conquered. The Ilkhanate, the expansive Mongol dominion he established through his widespread campaigns, represented far more than a mere wave of devastation sweeping through the Near East, leaving desolation in its wake. This was a thriving empire, fortified with distinct administrative frameworks, comprehensive taxation systems, structured legal codes, and hierarchical governance that endured for nearly a century. Empires demand more than just military might. They necessitate intricate bureaucracies, a truth Hulagu implicitly grasped. In Aleppo, the seamless transition from military subjugation to methodical administration began almost immediately. Hulagu appointed Fakhrin Saki to oversee the citadel and designated Tukal Bakshi as Shakna, a military governor tasked with maintaining order and maximizing revenue extraction. Alongside the military apparatus, Tajik administrative officials were installed. This exemplified the familiar imperial governance model, applied directly to the smoldering remains of a city that just 2 days prior had been the site of a brutal massacre. The stark contrast is almost surreal, yet it was meticulously planned. This transition, however, was not without its difficulties, as such endeavors rarely are. Soon after Hulagu departed Aleppo to press his campaign further south, the surviving populace voiced such vehement and serious complaints against Fakhrin Saki that Hulagu ultimately decreed his execution. Though the specific reasons for his failure are lost to history, the overarching pattern is clear. The initial administrator appointed to a newly conquered city, chosen for loyalty over capability, proved incapable of managing the complexities of governing a traumatized population. His successor was Zainuddin Hafizi, the very vizier who had previously served Aleppo's Ayyubid Sultan. Hafizi had secretly defected to Hulagu months before the siege, and according to Rashid Aline, this defection inflamed Hulagu's desire for the invasion in the first place. There's an almost literary quality to this detail. The individual instrumental in the city's downfall, by betraying its sultan to the adversary, now assumes charge of its ruins. History is rife with such ironies, which rarely find neat resolutions. Meanwhile, the intricate alliance politics born from the conquest generated their own ledger of obligations and rewards. Hethum I of Armenia fulfilled all his commitments. He brought his forces, fought valiantly, and significantly aided in the conquest. In reciprocity, Hulagu upheld his end of the agreement by returning territories that the Ayyubids had previously seized from the Armenian kingdom: tangible land, actual territory. This alliance carried a price, and that price was duly paid. This demonstrable reliability, the consistent fulfillment of Mongol promises to cooperative vassals, was a fundamental aspect of how their alliance system functioned. Without the promised protections and rewards for submission, the system would inevitably collapse. Hulagu understood this principle well. Bohemond VI of Antioch received analogous treatment. His principality was placed under Mongol protection, granting him a degree of stability and security that had eluded his position for decades. For a brief period in 1260, Antioch was more secure as a Mongol vassal than it had been as an independent crusader state. The irony of a crusader lord finding security through submission to a pagan Mongol ruler, rather than through the Christian alliances that were meant to be the bedrock of the crusader presence in the Levant, was not lost on contemporaries. This peculiar situation only deepened the burgeoning conviction that the world of 1260 had become truly unrecognizable. And then there was al-Nasir Yusuf, the fleeing sultan. He was apprehended near Gaza as his options systematically vanished. His flight southward had not spared him, but merely postponed the inevitable. Hulagu, in what can only be described as a masterpiece of cynical statecraft, pledged that upon the conquest of Egypt, al-Nasir Yusuf would be appointed viceroy of Syria, a mere consolation prize, a prospective role in a future empire to be erected atop the ashes of everything he had failed to defend. Al-Nasir accepted. What other option was there? Immediate death was the only alternative. Consequently, he was brought to Hulagu's court as a living trophy, a testament to the utter collapse of Ayyubid power, and held there, awaiting a future that would never materialize as he envisioned. His ultimate fate reveals everything about Hulagu's regard for his promises to adversaries. When events at a spring in Palestine dramatically altered the strategic landscape, a topic we are about to delve into, and the political calculations shifted, al-Nasir Yusuf was executed. The promised viceroyalty evaporated. It had never been a genuine vow, but rather a political management tool crafted to keep a symbolic figure passive and alive only as long as that passivity served Mongol interests. When it no longer did, the tool was summarily discarded. In Damascus, the repercussions of a peaceful surrender were by comparison considerably more civil, at least in the short term. Kitbuka governed the city with a degree of care for its continued operational stability. Reports exist, though some are debated by modern historians, detailing Christian worship services held in the Umayyad Mosque by Armenian and Frankish allies. Regardless of the precise accuracy of every reported detail, the underlying symbolism depicted aligns with all other knowledge concerning the coalition's character and subsequent events. The leading cities of the Islamic world now found themselves governed by a power deeply sympathetic to Christianity and profoundly adversarial toward the Sunni political structure that had dominated the region for 6 centuries. For Damascus's Muslim populace, this represented more than just a military loss. It was a symbolic reversal of their established world order. The mosque, once the grand cathedral of the Byzantine city, converted to Islam during early conquests, was now, at least temporarily and symbolically, back in Christian hands. 6 centuries of unbroken historical trajectory had been violently overturned in mere weeks. Yet, Damascus remained largely undamaged. Its inhabitants survived. Its structures stood firm. In the context of 1260, this constituted the most favorable outcome, and the Damascenes recognized this truth. They had observed Aleppo's fate and adjusted their calculations accordingly. The lessons learned from the siege had already altered the strategic behavior of every city in the region. This dissemination of dread, this change in conduct before any arrow was launched, showcased the Mongol system's intended efficacy. Concurrently, Hulagu formally accepted submissions from the Ayyubid princes who governed the smaller Syrian cities like Hama and Homs, who arrived bearing tributes. The conquest of Syria was finalized. Hulagu stood poised on the brink of Palestine, with Egypt next in his sights. However, an underlying issue, brewing since August of the previous year, persisted. This matter, which Hulagu had consistently deferred while completing his campaign, could no longer be set aside. His brother, the respected great Khan monk, had passed away. I wish to pause and genuinely pose a question. Is there a meaningful ethical distinction between a conqueror who slaughters and then governs versus one who merely slaughters and moves on? Does Hulagu's inclination towards state-building alter our assessment of his actions? I believe there's no straightforward answer, which is precisely why I ask. Please share your insights in the comments. This is among the most intensely debated questions among Ilkhanate historians, and the spectrum of responses offered reveals much about individual perspectives on power and history more broadly. Mamluk Khan had died in August 1259, 5 months before the siege of Aleppo even commenced. His death during the campaign in China was attributed to dysentery or possibly cholera, depending on the historical source consulted. He was 51 years old. He had served as the central axis around which the entire Mongol Empire cohesive. The Supreme Khan, whose authority linked the Ilkhanate in the west, the Golden Horde in the north, the Chagatai in Central Asia, and the expanding empire in China into a cohesive, albeit imperfect, single political entity. His demise created a power vacuum at the pinnacle of the most formidable empire the world had ever witnessed. Hulagu was aware of this. He received the news via messenger while still engaged in his Syrian campaign. According to Rashid al-Din, he experienced profound grief but concealed it. He pressed onward. He captured Aleppo. He accepted Damascus's surrender. He was completing the mission his brother had assigned him, and he was determined to finish it. Yet, time was of the essence, and every senior Mongol leader knew it. The issue of succession was immediate and fraught with peril. Two of Mamluk's brothers, Kublai and Erik Boka, were already vying for the impending power struggle. Both had claimed the title of Great Khan in disputed assemblies. A civil war within the Mongol Empire was not hypothetical. It was actively unfolding. As a prominent member of the House of Tului, Hulagu possessed both a personal stake and a political obligation regarding the resolution of this conflict. He backed Kublai, which meant he needed to be strategically positioned geographically, politically, and militarily to influence the outcome, or, at minimum, safeguard his own interests amidst the shifting landscape of Mongol imperial politics. This necessitated that Syria be put on hold, or, more accurately, managed with a reduced force while Hulagu moved eastward to prepare himself for the larger political game. Consequently, in the spring of 1260, Hulagu withdrew from Syria. This was not a panicked retreat or a response to military pressure. It represented a deliberate strategic redeployment. He took the vast majority of his troops, the bulk of that immense coalition army, back east towards Azerbaijan, which served as his administrative hub. He left Kitbaka in Syria with what various sources estimate to be between 10,000 and 20,000 Mongol soldiers, supplemented by allied contingents. Reflect on that numerical range for an instant, between 10,000 and 20,000. Such was the contingent tasked with securing the entirety of Syria, a geographical expanse encompassing Damascus, stretching from the Euphrates River to the Mediterranean Sea, and bordering both the Crusader territories and the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. This relatively small unit was expected to govern, project authority, conduct offensive actions, counter threats, and prepare for a potential northward advance into Egypt. The force that had laid waste to Aleppo in a mere 6 days had exceeded 100,000 soldiers. What remained was a skeletal crew, a garrison force, albeit one that was competent, seasoned, professional, and commanded by one of the Mongol Empire's most distinguished leaders. Yet it was a mere fraction compared to the vast army that had just subjugated half of the Islamic Near East. Meanwhile, in Cairo, the Mamluk Sultanate was observing the situation and strategizing. The Mamluks themselves constituted a political entity without any historical precedent or equivalent in the medieval era. They formed a sultanate literally comprised of military slaves, predominantly of Kipchak Turkic heritage, who had been acquired as children from the Eurasian steppes. These youths were brought to Egypt, undergoing rigorous military training from an early age, which produced some of the world's most formidable cavalry soldiers.
Upon completing their training, they converted to Islam, were granted their freedom, and became integrated into a warrior class that, a decade prior, had usurped political authority in Egypt from their Ayyubid overlords. They were, in the most literal sense, career soldiers who had devoted their lives to preparing for warfare since childhood. Furthermore, they possessed a profound understanding of the steppe warrior tradition because it was their own heritage. The Kipchak Turks, from whom the majority of Mamluks originated, were themselves steppe dwellers. This background provided them with an insight into Mongol tactics that no purely sedentary army could ever hope to attain. Their new sultan, Qutuz, had ascended to power just a year earlier, in 1259, specifically on a platform of resistance against the Mongols. His predecessor had been perceived as insufficiently proactive in preparing for the Mongol threat. Qutuz removed him, positioning himself as the individual who would genuinely confront the invaders. And now, in the spring of 1260, with Hulagu's primary forces having withdrawn and Kitpaka's diminished garrison thinly dispersed across Syria, the opportune moment that Qutuz had been anticipating had arrived. The Mongols dispatched emissaries to Qutuz, demanding his submission, the customary ultimatum that had preceded every Mongol conquest. Submit, acknowledge the great Khan's supremacy, pay tribute, and survive. Resist and face the repercussions. Qutuz responded by having the envoys executed. Their deaths were orchestrated in a manner specifically intended to convey absolute, unyielding defiance. Their bodies were severed in two and displayed at the gates of Cairo. This was no impulsive act. It was not an emotional outburst. This was a meticulously planned declaration of war, crafted to render negotiation or retreat impossible and to irrevocably commit his populace to the path of confrontation. Qutuz recognized that half-hearted measures against the Mongols were not a viable option. One either fought them with everything available or surrendered. There was no middle ground. And then he undertook a course of action that, according to every rational military assessment, bordered on lunacy. He marched north. The Mamluk army at that juncture likely numbered between 10,000 and 15,000 effective combatants, roughly equivalent to, or perhaps slightly outnumbering, Kitpaka's depleted force. However, behind Kitpaka loomed the immense power of the entire Ilkhanate, the vast Mongol Empire. Behind the Mamluks, there was nothing but Egypt and the desert beyond. If the Mamluks suffered defeat in this engagement, no second army awaited in reserve. There would be no fresh cavalry units to charge to their rescue. Egypt would fall next. And after Egypt, no power in the Islamic world would be capable of resisting ensuing Mongol aggression. Qutuz was aware of this. His officers were aware of this. His general, Baybars, the former slave who had escaped Mongol captivity years earlier, who knew the topography of Palestine as intimately as his own name, who had cultivated, through years of arduous experience, the tactical acumen that would characterize his career, was aware of this. And yet, they marched. Among those advancing was a man whose name, within a few months, would become the most prominent in the Islamic world. Baybars, a Kipchak Turk by birth, captured during an early Mongol raid into the steppes as a child, sold through slave markets into Egypt, trained as a Mamluk warrior, and having ascended through the ranks to become one of Qutuz's most skilled commanders, was a man who comprehended Mongol psychology and tactics from an insider's perspective because he shared the same cultural heritage as many of the men he was about to face. He harbored personal motivations for desiring the Mongols' defeat and possessed exceptional ability to bring that about. However, Baybars' full narrative, what he accomplished at Ain Jalut and immediately thereafter, which in some respects surpasses the battle itself in remarkable quality, is a contemplation for a subsequent occasion. My aim here is to paint a picture of two armies converging on the Palestinian landscape in September 1260. One force comprises the remnants of what devastated Aleppo in 6 days and took Damascus without a fight. The other is marching bravely to confront them, a rare feat for any Islamic power since the Mongols first arrived in the Near East, choosing not to await destruction. Between them lies Palestine, and within it a modest spring in the Jezreel Valley,
believed to be where David once slew Goliath, known in Arabic as Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath. In September 1260, the lingering question since Baghdad's fall, Aleppo's burning, and Damascus's quiet surrender, whether the Mongol advance in the Near East was truly unstoppable, destined to sweep across to the Atlantic, was on the verge of being answered. Let's briefly pause to consider the implications of what we've covered today. In just 6 days, the Mongols achieved what no military had accomplished in a century and a half. They shattered Aleppo. They besieged a city that crusaders had repeatedly failed to conquer, deploying 120,000 troops, assigning 4 commanders to 4 gates. They relentlessly assaulted the walls for a week, using the era's most advanced siege engines, breaching the Iraq Gate before defenders could seal it. Over the subsequent 6 days, they systematically dealt with the vanquished populace with the cold efficiency of an organization seasoned in such operations. In the ensuing weeks, they installed administrators, compensated their allies, and entered Damascus unopposed. Then, they paused at Palestine's edge, gazing south towards Egypt. The geopolitical map of the medieval Islamic world had been completely redrawn in less than a year. What was the true significance of Aleppo's downfall? Beyond its evident military consequences, I want to explore its deeper meaning. Historical narratives often emphasize Baghdad as the pivotal event in the Mongol subjugation of the Islamic world, which is understandable. !! at meta. Quote, pause, quote, colon, quote, sex, quote, colon, 1.0. Baghdad was the symbolic heart, the seat of the caliphate, representing the Islamic world's political unity since 750 AD. Its destruction was a civilizational blow of immense magnitude. However, I propose Aleppo's impact was distinct and, strategically, perhaps even more crucial. Baghdad was the heart, but Aleppo was the portal. With Baghdad lost, the Islamic world forfeited its spiritual and political center. With Aleppo gone, it lost the physical conduit between the East and the Levant. Together, these 2 losses created a situation where no functional center remained, nor any defensible border between the Mongol Empire and the surviving Islamic powers. Everything from the Tigris to the Nile was either already under Mongol sway or in the process of submitting. The logical conclusion of this trajectory was Egypt. And beyond Egypt, there seemed to be no natural stopping point. Here's a what-if scenario I find profoundly compelling and ultimately unanswerable. What if Mamluk Khan hadn't died? Had the Great Khan survived 1259 and 1260? Had a disease in China been slightly less lethal at a different moment? Hulagu would have had no reason to retreat eastward. His entire army, all 120,000 men, would have been available to press southward. The Mamluks would have confronted not Kitbuka's 10,000 to 20,000 troops, but the very force that demolished Aleppo in 6 days. At that juncture, the question isn't about Babar's tactical brilliance, for he was indeed among his century's most gifted commanders, but whether brilliance alone suffices against a 5-to-1 numerical disadvantage in cavalry, especially when facing the world's elite cavalry. I truly don't know the answer. Nor does anyone else. Yet, when I dwell on that counterfactual, when I envision how the world might have unfolded had that campaign succeeded, no Mamluk Empire, no Ottoman Empire as we know it, Islamic civilization serving as a subordinate entity within a Mongol-governed Near East, the entire subsequent history of the Mediterranean world irrevocably altered in ways I can scarcely imagine. I grasped the full weight of what Munka's dysentery genuinely signified. One man's death from an illness thousands of miles away shaped the trajectory of Islamic civilization for centuries. History abounds with such instances. We tend to attribute historical outcomes to deep structural forces, economic trends, demographic pressures, and technological advancements. And these elements are undeniably significant. Yet, history equally hinges on discrete incidents, individual fatalities, and choices made by single individuals under immense duress and with inadequate information.
The demise of Monk wasn't predetermined by prevailing forces. He found himself in an unfortunate situation. A microorganism, oblivious to the fate of civilizations, simply acted as microorganisms do, and the global landscape shifted. Aleppo, surprisingly, barely endured, and not without further hardship. The city faced the plague in 1348 and Timur's devastation in 1400, which arguably rivaled the Mongols' impact, shattering its populace and economy in ways that took generations to mend. Yet mend it did. This recovery occurred under the rule of the Mamluks, who eventually regained control of Syria and revitalized its urban centers. Later, under the Ottomans, who integrated Syria into their empire in 1516, Aleppo was rebuilt, repopulated, and reimagined, becoming a leading commercial hub in their domain. By the 16th century, Aleppo had re-emerged as one of the Near East's largest cities. Its markets were reconstructed and expanded. Its trade routes were operational once more, and its diverse communities, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, coexisted in the rich, intricate tapestry that had always defined the city at its zenith. The citadel, too, underwent reconstruction, though it never fully regained the precise form Al-Zahir Ghazi had bestowed upon it, and subsequent centuries brought their own alterations and damage. It was rebuilt, it stands to this day. Indeed, one can visit it, tread its ancient stones, and gaze down from its ramparts at a city that has now weathered conquest, plague, earthquakes, and one of the 21st century's most brutal civil conflicts. What resonates with me most, after immersing myself in this narrative for so long, is the sequence of human choices that shaped this outcome. The steadfast refusal to yield, the Sultan's hasty retreat, the alliance of Armenian and Crusader forces, the torching of the mosque, the garrison defending a hill above a ruined city for 32 days with no prospect of assistance, Hulagu's eastward withdrawal, and the Mamluks' decision to advance north rather than passively wait. Each of these decisions was made by a person at a specific juncture, under particular pressures, and with limited foresight. And each of those decisions irrevocably altered the world that followed. This is the essence of history. It always is. Individuals making choices in obscurity, facing consequences they barely grasp, and then enduring or perishing based on those choices. Aleppo fell in 6 days. The massacre persisted for an additional 6. The citadel held for 32. And the chain of events unleashed during those 44 days would mold the medieval Near East for 2 centuries, beginning with a confrontation at a spring in a valley in Lower Galilee, where, for the first time in the Mongol Empire's Near Eastern campaigns, an army confronted them head-on and did not retreat. The unfolding of events at Ain Jalut is the next chapter, and I assure you, it is every bit as extraordinary as what you've learned today. If this video sparked your thoughts, please click the like button. It truly helps this channel reach individuals who value serious historical content. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll meet you at Ain Jalut. You won't want to miss what happens next.